It's now time to hear from our panel, the topic, Facing the Future, Making Pivots and Choosing Priorities. And at this time, I would like to invite our panelists up to the stage. Our distinguished moderator, Patricia Swan, Senior Program Officer, Thriving Communities at New York Community Trust. Pat is a board member of Philanthropy New York, Brooklyn Workforce Innovations, and an advisory committee member of the New York City Office of Local Initiatives, Support Corporations. Good morning. And our panelists, Amanda Kraus, founder and executive director, Row New York, Thomas Crever, CEO, Hetrick Morton Institute, Jennifer Mitchell, executive director, the Hope Program, and Diane Morales, executive director and CEO, Phipps Neighborhoods. The details about our panelists are in your kits. And with that, Pat, over to you.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. So, as Claire mentioned, I'm a senior program officer at New York Community Trust, and it's my pleasure to support and be a part of this symposium every year. The Better Business Bureau staff, Claire and Luana and the team there make everything easy, and I always get a tremendous amount out of these conversations. So I'm hoping that I will be able to continue that trend this morning with this amazing panel of nonprofit leaders. And I'm going to start with a personal anecdote that is just fascinating. Actually, it's not, but I think it's relevant, and so bear with me. So this weekend, I stubbed my toe. My pinky on my right foot is crying out right now, but it actually made me reflect, strangely enough, on the nonprofit sector. Because here you have what often is a sort of unrecognized, underappreciated, undervalued, and for people who don't work in this sector, probably not for the people in this room, but for people who don't work in the sector, what many people might even consider a non-essential part of society. Likewise, we often think of our pinky as sort of a, nice, we know it's there, but you don't often think of it a whole lot. And so I did the usual routine things. I put an ice pack and I elevated my foot and everything seemed okay, not a very big deal, until I tried to put on shoes and go outside and walk around. And so I guess, I know the analogy doesn't hold up all the way through, but it struck me that when a seemingly non-essential part of society makes noise, makes trouble, speaks out, shouts its pain, the rest of society often has to stop and pay attention or otherwise risk limping along in pain, for quite some time. And so I share that with all of you respected folks who do the frontline work in the nonprofit world, and of course the philanthropic world wouldn't exist without you. And I share that and ask you to keep that in context in the months and years to come. So speaking of the months and years to come, this is going to be a very interesting time. But let's face it, every decade brings its uncertainties. And has there ever really been a time when nonprofit leaders don't have to be nimble? So this panel is going to discuss how in this particular time, nonprofit leaders are being nimble and how nonprofit organizations are pivoting in these uncertain times. And we're going to start with a brief 3-minute introduction from each panelist, including a description of the organization and its mission. Then I'll ask a few questions. And then we'll open it up to questions from you. And as Claire mentioned, you have index cards in your folder, so if a question occurs to you as someone is speaking, jot it down, hold it up. I think they'll be collected throughout the conversation, and then we'll try to get to as many of them as we can throughout the morning. So we'll start with the intros, and then I'll launch into a couple of questions just to get our conversation started. So let's start with, to my left, Thomas Krever, who is CEO of the the Hedrick Martin Institute, and I'll let you go down the line, and then we'll come back to me.
Hold me to 3 minutes. Good morning, everyone. My name, as you know, Thomas Krever. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of what we call the Hedrick Martin Institute, HMI, home of Harvey Milk High School. Many of people have heard us by that, and I see a lot of head shaking. Less known, we're the nation's oldest and largest LGBTQ, the Q in this context means questioning, organization, and that's because we provide a safe and supportive environment for young people between the ages of 13 through their 24th birthday, so up to 25. We work with about 2,500 young people a year. About 94% are youth of color, and over 82% are Title I, so we know that we are reaching those most in need. We are located here in New York, right at 2 Astor Place. We provide, aside from home of Harvey Milk High School by day, what is probably the nation's largest LGBTQ youth-focused outreach program, 6 days a week, 2 times a day, looking throughout all 5 boroughs, up through Westchester, where young people, particularly LGBTQ or straight allied young people, might congregate, so that we can bring them back to our space, where we provide the largest hot meal program in the United States for LGBT youth and their straight allies, as well as an array of after-school programs like arts and culture programs, job readiness programs, health and wellness programs, and academic enrichment programs. Aside from that, a few years back, which we'll probably talk about in a moment or two, we opened what is our Advocacy and Capacity Building Center, so technical assistance, support, policy work, for both city or state institutions as well as NGOs or corporations. And so working with them in a very one-on-one, non-prescriptive way to create safer, more inclusive environments for LGBT people. We're also just recently the first organization, we're happy but we're sad that this is the first, to actually go what we call federated. So we've now expanded into what's called HMI New Jersey. And so we have boots on the ground in Newark, and we're replicating our programs from New York after almost 40 years in the state of New Jersey.
Thank you, Thomas. All right, and next we have Diane Morales. Diane, please introduce yourself and say a little bit about Phipps Neighborhood.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm thrilled to be here with you all this morning. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of Phipps Neighborhoods. Phipps Neighborhoods is celebrating its 45th year anniversary this year, so it's a plug for us. We are an anti-poverty organization that focuses on targeted communities in the South Bronx that experience some of the highest levels of poverty. We look to create a cradle to college and career pipeline so that we can break that cycle of poverty, and we do that in providing services in some key areas. We focus on education, critical education services, both in the community and in schools, in partnerships with schools. We focus on career development, and I say that specifically because we made a deliberate decision several years ago, actually not to just do job placement, but to really try to focus on creating career pathways for young adults in our communities so that they could, A, make choices about their careers, but also move into careers that provided opportunities for long-term self-sufficiency. We did an analysis of workforce and the sectors where there's growth coming into the community, and made that deliberate decision. The other thing that we do is what we call community resources, which is really sort of the idea of what are some of the critical resources and additional supports that any given individual needs in order to most take advantage of that education or career program. How do you do that, right? So you need basic things like healthcare. You need basic things like a roof over your head, and so we work in a concentrated way to integrate those things so that we can provide them holistically and seamlessly for the community members that we serve. finally, we focus our services in very targeted, specific communities. So there are the areas in the South Bronx that statistically are shown to have the highest levels of poverty, the highest levels of unemployment, the highest levels of, or the lowest levels of educational attainment, and all of those things concentrated. And we seek to do that in an integrated way, looking at and tracking the impact that we have on households over time. So that's who we are, and I'm thrilled to be here this morning.
Thank you, Diane. And next, Amanda Kraus, who is founder and executive director of Row New York. Amanda?
Great, thank you. It's fun being here with the New York Community Trust because you guys hold a very special place in my heart. I don't know if you know this, Pat, but I spoke with another Pat when I was first starting Row New York. I came to New York City years ago, let's put it this way, I was in my 20s, and I went to New York Community Trust and said, I have this idea to start a nonprofit serving girls in New York City from under-resourced communities. I want to provide academics and competitive rowing. And another Pat.
There were three of us.
Yeah,
there are two of us now. We're down to two.
Yes.
We're all excellent and talented.
Yes.
Very well.
It's true. It's very true. Looked at me and said, you know, here are all the reasons that probably won't work. But she was kind of amazing in that way and said, you know, do this, and then come back to me in 6 months, and we'll see where you are. And I think she probably thought I'd never come back. But I did come back 6 months later, and I sat in her office and said, okay, Pat, I did all of these things, now what? And we received our very first grant ever from New York Community Trust. So it was I still have the bottle of champagne that we bought on my desk celebrating that, and that was 2003 or 4.
Wow.
So before that point, we had $5, my $5 that I put in a Chase checking account, and then $50,000 from New York Community Trust, which was sort of more money than I'd ever seen in my life. So Row New York is an organization that I started originally to serve girls from under-resourced communities. We now serve boys as well. We're a competitive rowing and academic program for girls and boys in New York City, as well as people with disabilities. So any Saturday, any New Yorker with a physical or cognitive disability can come to Meadow Lake in Queens and learn to row with us. The core of our program is our mission-based programs, such as middle school and high school programs, that provide competitive rowing and academic support 6 days a week, year-round. So, you know, we have people always ask, well, where do you do this? So I'll get right to that. We have 3 sites now. Our offices are in Manhattan, and our boathouses are in Queens on Meadow Lake, the Harlem River in Washington Heights, Inwood area, and we just launched Brooklyn on Patagat Basin in Canarsie, Brooklyn. So the idea is we recruit school children from under-resourced communities in schools that really we know the children are not receiving other services. So we're not going to the Bronx Sciences of the world. We're really looking at like the Flushing High School, South Shore High School, and recruiting those kids. We bring them in, we do a lot of swim lessons, we teach them to row. Eventually our kids are competing throughout the Northeast, and we do academics as well. So a lot of college readiness, test prep, college visits, an academic enrichment program. We're very focused on self-efficacy and grit and being good community members. So it's really a wraparound program for young people. And that is Row New York in a nutshell, or 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. And next we have Jennifer Mitchell, who's Executive Director of the HOPE program. Jennifer?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Good morning.
So glad to be here today. So as Pat said, I'm Executive Director of the HOPE program. I also, as of a year and a half ago, am Executive Director of Sustainable South Bronx, which joined the HOPE program's portfolio of programs about a year and a half ago. And I'm sure later in this panel we'll kind of talk about how and why that happened, but it was certainly a pivotal moment. So HOPE and Sustainable South Bronx combined have the mission of working with folks who are unemployed unemployed and living in poverty and helping them transform their lives through training, job placement, and advancement support so that they can be self-sufficient, contributing, productive members of society. We say when you're hope for life, and we provide lifetime services. So people come to us from all different places with all sorts of barriers, and then through 6 different programs that they have choices of participating in, we help them to get jobs and then to move up the career ladder. We have headquarters in both Brooklyn and the Bronx now, and in Brooklyn we run 2 programs, one called Hope Works, which is a general work readiness program. It's 10 weeks, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, really rigorous kind of attendance and time expectations, computer skills, resume prep, mindfulness, meditation, and then very contextualized training in skills like for the fields of animal care, clerical, social services, and custodial. We also, in our Brooklyn offices, run a Food Works program, which is 8 weeks. Same thing, Monday through Friday night. All our programs are Monday through Friday, full-time. That's preparing people for back-of-the-house and front-of-the-house positions in the food industry. We launched that. We're over 30 years old as a nonprofit, and HopeWorks was our general work readiness program and our signature program for most of our history. 8 years ago, when sector-based training became kind of a thing to talk about and explore, we launched FoodWorks. We've seen great success with that. We have amazingly committed employer partners in the food industry and are constantly getting calls as people's first choice of that. Again, very holistic programming. In the Bronx, we run a green workforce development program, again, full-time, preparing people for jobs in green maintenance and green construction. And then we also, in partnership with New York City Small Business Services, run the New York City Cool Roofs program, which is a transitional employment program. So all of our other programs are classroom-based, and then people get internships or volunteer assignments before they end up being placed in jobs and supported with their career. This program, you actually come in and you're getting paid from day one to be painting rooftops all over New York City with reflective coating to make them more energy efficient, while at the same time you're getting the wraparound soft skills and support services that you get from all the other programs. We were very fortunate about 1.5 years ago to be awarded through the Mayor's Fund to Advance New York Connections to Care grant, which has allowed us to embed mental health services in all of our programs. So all of our staff are trained in motivational interviewing, psychoeducation, mental health first aid, among other things. It's made a tremendous difference in the people that we serve's lives, because our staff are now more skilled at identifying what's going on and better able to target who they can work with and how we can work effectively based on someone's mental health needs as well. We're very excited, as we're thrilled to be partners with New York Community Trust. We also are partners with Robin Hood Foundation and are going through our a 5-year strategic planning process right now, which again I think will come up later, but it's our 3rd one in our history, and it's really helping us to kind of think about how to navigate in this time of uncertainty in the nonprofit space. I think you also wanted us to mention our budget size. And so Hope and Sustainable South Bronx combined are about $4.2 million a year annual budget. We serve over 500 first-time enrollees every year, and then a couple hundred graduates that come back for advancement services and advancement help. And I think that's it. Thank you. So glad to be here today.
All right. Thank you so much. I am totally blown away by the richness and the breadth of the services and the good work that these organizations are doing. And I will say that you know, we tried very consciously to shape a panel that would represent a broad spectrum of organizations in terms of size, in terms of age, in terms of mission. And so thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that information about the budget size. And as we go along, if our other panelists want to share that kind of information, that's totally okay as well. So we have a lot of pivot tools that we can talk about. And so I thought we might start with downsizing. And I know you're thinking, wow, that's a downer. Why do we want to start with downsizing? Well, Downsizing or shedding programs is one way that nonprofit leaders respond to uncertain times. And it seems counterintuitive, but downsizing can also be the first phase of actually a period of growth and expansion and a stronger, more solid organization with solid programs that are aligned with its mission at its core. And so I'd like to start with Diane because she's had an experience recently at Phipps Neighborhoods with that whole notion. And I wanted to ask Diane if she would share her experience and say if she thought it was an anomaly or if it's something that other organizations might consider a lesson learned.
Sure. Thanks, Pat. So I think part of the context for this is that in this nonprofit sector, in the human services sector in particular, I think that given the way that we're funded, given the way that contracts are run, we often feel like we have to sort of chase the dollars. I think that, you know, a lot of us often make decisions to provide a service that isn't part of our normal menu of services or to provide a service in an area or a community where we normally don't do that. And I think that one of the things that I encountered when I first arrived at Phipps, and I'm going to count on you all to not quote me on this, is that we were kind of a mile wide and an inch deep. And I've said that to my board. We were doing a lot of different things, but it didn't feel like we were doing anything particularly well. And so we actually went through a theory of change process. And I have to say, actually, that the idea of admitting that publicly and admitting that to our funders was taboo. Right? You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to figure out how to spin it so that it sounds that you're doing something well and you're making a difference. And I sort of decided that that was not going to work for us. That I really wanted us to find the things that we did well and to find a way to do that. And so we went through a theory of change process, and as a result of that, we landed on the programs that I talked about in my introduction in terms of what we're doing. And that it was not an easy process. It required us acknowledging what we didn't do well. It required staff and leadership sort of confronting that, and that becomes a very personal thing when it's the program that you're running, right? It's very hard to sort of acknowledge that, right? You can find all kinds of ways to justify and rationalize why you need to continue to exist. And so we made the decision at that point in time to narrow. And in doing that, it wasn't a deliberate sort of we're downsizing decision. That sort of ended up happening as a result of being true to our theory of change. The decision was we will not actively pursue or focus resources on these areas that we have determined are not really effective or not really priorities for us. So there was a natural attrition that happened for us throughout that process. The other thing that happened actually as well was that in the areas where we felt we had some expertise and really had something to offer, those programs got deeper and we started to show remarkably different impact and outcomes, statistically significant, because we also invested in that at that point in time in doing an evaluation, right? In measuring the impact on our participants versus, I'll give you a perfect example, the impact of on our participants in a school versus students in that same school who were not benefiting from our services. And we found that there was a difference. In time, part of what started to happen was that there was an increased demand for our services, and that there was an increased desire to mimic some of our best practices. And so the New York City Department of Youth and Community Development actually adopted one of our practices as a result of that. So we found that we were actually able to grow and expand, and we've gone from a $16 million organization 5 years ago to a $26 million organization today. And that wasn't, I mean, that was not necessarily part of the plan. But we did decide to respond to the demand with the areas that we had decided that we wanted to focus on. And because we felt like we had developed that expertise, the growth made sense.
Thank you very much. And please feel free to chime in if anyone has any other experiences to share on this whole question of downsizing and how it can be the beginning of an opportunity to grow.
I would just add, I agree with what Diane said. If you're outcomes oriented and you're data driven, it makes decisions like that easier to make because it's based not on anecdotes or people's feelings. It's based on kind of hard numbers. And so we spend a lot of time looking at our outcomes, not just how many people we serve or how many people we place, but how many people are still working 1 year later. And our average through all our programs is that 74% of the people we serve are still working 1 year later. We had one program that we launched. We worked with Morgan Stanley to figure out what was another sector we should explore and train people in because of employer demand. We talked to staff about it. Staff were invested. Everybody, the board was invested, and we launched a retail training program. And over the year that we operated that, we dug deep into enrollment numbers, program completion numbers, placement numbers, wages, everything. And when we looked at it, we had diverted resources from something else to be able to run that program. And when we looked at the results compared to the HopeWorks program, which we had shrunk down a little bit in order to do this, it didn't make sense. And so it was a hard decision because we had invested a lot of time into the planning, prep, and rollout of the program. But because we're so data driven, it was easy to kind of see after a year that it didn't make sense, and we shifted those resources back to a program that it made more sense in. And it was a great learning experience for all the staff that was involved.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to stick with you, Jennifer. Mergers and collaborations, another toolbox in the pivot tool, another tool in the pivot toolbox. Each merger and each collaboration has its own very distinct personality. There's always very unique circumstances, but there's also something to learn from each one of them. And you mentioned earlier the merger with Sustainable South Bronx. So I wonder if you could share the journey that you and your board took to get to that place where that merger made a lot of sense and has been a successful pivot for the organization.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I'm going to start actually talking about the Sustainable South Bronx board and senior staff, and because they were, in my mind, the really brave ones in this. Hope had been poised for growth, and we had a board retreat a few years ago that we had decided we were interested in growing, but very mission specific. And so we were looking for additional sectors that made sense to train people in based on kind of labor market statistics. We were looking to expand geographically in New York, so we had been historically a very Brooklyn-based nonprofit. We knew there was high need in lots of other places, and so we're looking to expand geographically. And also, we, as a workforce development organization, we felt it was very important to kind of walk the walk and practice what we preach, and we wanted to have a social enterprise so that when we were talking to our employer partners, we could talk about how we also have a business that employs the graduates of our program. So our three kind of things in the back of our mind were geographic expansion, sectoral expansion, and a social enterprise. Sustainable South Bronx, which for those of you who are not familiar with it, was started about 15 years ago in the South Bronx, primarily at first as an environmental justice advocacy organization, and then over time had developed a really stellar green workforce development program and also a successful social enterprise. Was really kind of struggling, similar to what you said. They were doing a lot of things but had a really little budget, and so it was kind of impossible to get all of their things accomplished, and yet the board and senior staff were really kind of wedded to all those things and couldn't necessarily see the forest through the trees to figure out what made sense to not do anymore, what made sense to continue. So they were the ones that kind of started looking for a home and a stable place to do. And for folks who aren't familiar with Sea Change Capital Partners, John McIntosh, he and his staff are kind of gurus on nonprofit mergers, acquisitions, collaborations. So we went to them first, A, to get their feedback and their insights, and B, to see if there was funding available to support this exploration. And there was, and they were very supportive and very informative. And you also learned, because they were an environmental organization and we were workforce development. So for some people it was like, wait, that doesn't make sense. But what we really learned through the beginning of research on what makes sense is two organizations that are doing the exact same thing, it doesn't necessarily make sense to put them together. 1 + 1 don't always equal 2 in that case. And so their board had gone through a process of exploring a few different nonprofits that could be potential homes. Our board had done the process of saying, okay, it was a fit for the growth factors we were looking for. And then in addition to Sea Change support, we secured some other financial support and engaged a consultant in a year-long process where there were board members on both sides, senior staff on both sides, that every month, 2 or 3 times a month for like 3 hours in the evening would sit and go through topics. So we covered legal due diligence, financial due diligence, program capacity, organizational capacity, budget projections, going and see what funders were overlapping. I mean, you name it, we like looked under the hood and really tried to figure out if this would make sense before leaping into it. And then we were really excited in July of 2015, both boards voted unanimously to move forward with it, and we signed an affiliation agreement, and on October 1st, 2015, we became a combined organization. And what has been really amazing is that I think because of all the due diligence, and the fact that Hope's board in particular is pretty risk averse, we had really dotted our I's and crossed our T's in a way and had been so conservative in our projections on what would happen that we have actually, over the past year and a half, really surpassed the expectations that we had for how strong we could be as a combined organization. And if people have more specific questions after, but that's kind of the story of it all.
Thank you very much. So we could probably get a merger or collaboration kind of story from each of our panelists, and we might circle back to that. But let's move on, and I'd like to have a conversation that centers on the staff of nonprofit organizations that are in that pivot mode. We all know that wages and compensation in the nonprofit world are not what they should be, and so as a result, the frontline staff are often not that far removed in their economic circumstances and situation from the people that they're counseling and the people that they're actually trying to help. And so in uncertain times like these, they're faced with sort of a triple stress threat. So they may be worried about their job. They may be worried about and concerned about the fact that the demand for services are likely to increase at the same time that the resources for the organization are actually decreasing or staying stagnant. And then they may be concerned because they may realize that if they're out of a job or if they're downsized, they may be faced with economic circumstances that are actually not that different from those of the people that they're trying to help. So it can be a really, really stressful time for the frontline staff of nonprofit organizations. So I guess I'll throw this out to everybody. What is the way that an organization in the pivot mode can be supportive of frontline staff in ways, you know, oftentimes you have to think creatively. You can't really offer a raise, or you can't offer a raise that really is the what you'd like to be able to offer, but there are other ways that you can be supportive. So I'd love to hear thoughts and ideas on how that can happen for an organization that's in that pivot mode.
May I? So I think something that you just said is really important, and we tend in this, particularly in social service sector or human service sector, we tend to kind of gloss or glance over and not really give it the energy it needs, the attention that it needs. And that is recognizing who's drawn to the work in the first place, right? So prior to coming to HMI, I did a lot of national work and gang intervention work. And recognizing that really brought in a certain type of staffer, and then looking at LGBT work and the type of people that brought in, and then, so staying with that for a second, because the last thing with budgets so small or tight and capacity and bandwidth so taut, to invest energy, which means money, and time into something that's going to crash and burn because you didn't do that analysis first. I think that that is a big aha moment for us at HMI. So it was really looking at, it starts with the people, right? Because any organization is only as good as the people that provide the services. And so who are those people? Why are they drawn to the work? What's their story? And there's a lot of commonality, for better or worse, around the people that are drawn to an organization or the sector. So looking at, in HMI's case, people who have been marginalized, people who have tend to be overwhelmingly black and brown and be outside and with poverty affecting their own lives, and recognizing, for me, as someone of privilege, meaning lower middle class white guy from Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, what was my role in really making spaces, right? What was my responsibility to do that? And turning to the staff and having really honest conversations. They know and can articulate what they need, what they thought was most helpful for them. So the conversations started and stayed for longer than most people would be comfortable, frankly, in that space. And then looking at, as you mentioned, what were low-cost ways, free ways, what were ways that partners outside can help? A lot of times, particularly in our sector, we tend to forget that there are other stakeholders in the greater community that want you to succeed. How do you build those bridges? How do you let them in? How do you let your local banks and corporations or foundations come in and provide that work, that service? And so doing things like we have what's called Staff Appreciation Days that are 10 floating days that we set up in the beginning of the year where we look for holidays and we kind of tack on an extra Monday or a Friday so that you now get a 3-day weekend. Or what are the months, because they exist.
That's pretty cool. I would like one. I'd like that. That sounds like a great idea.
And I'll tell you why. So for instance, I got to HMI in 2003. My entire career has always been working with education systems. So I've always been used to being off between I celebrate Christmas and New Year's. And so my first year ever working was 2003, that week. And I was miserable. But you march the party line and you go to work. And then I looked around, and so was everyone else. They were miserable. And so were the 14 young people that showed up. And so what a silly use of resources. And talk about the depression around the holidays, because these were staff that couldn't afford to go home or that felt burdened to be there. They're the hardest working people in showbiz, so to speak, right? But it's recognizing it just didn't work and doing it because that's what you used to do. And so that kind of began that idea of self-care and appreciation. It's bringing in local masseuse schools who have to practice on bodies, and bringing them in, and acupuncturists, and I did my first readers, and I learned I needed glasses 2 years ago at self-care. So bringing in the community and really allowing them to help us was a big part of the effort as well. Really focusing on professional development. We're in New York City. There's so much free and low-cost support out there. It's I won't say it's ridiculous. I just said it. It's amazing. How's that? And so really utilizing those services and creating conduits, supporting it systemically at the organization so that your staff know and are celebrated and encouraged to go out there and hone their skills, because at the end of the day, young people's lives are better off for that. So those were some of the things we employed.
Very nice. Anyone else want to share?
So I'll just share one quick thing. A couple of years ago, we decided to develop what we call the Staff Innovation Fund. And so once a year, staff submit projects or proposals that they'd be interested in doing. They're supplemental to whatever program they're currently running, and they're low cost. So it's about a $5,000 fund. It gives staff the opportunity to develop something that they think is going to work. They submit the proposals, there's a review panel, there's a whole selection process, and a big sort of, we make a big deal out of kind of announcing the winner. But that does a couple of things. I think it's great for morale. It gives them an opportunity to lead and innovate and initiate. And it also ultimately really benefits the people that they're serving. You know, we've had a school start a DJ lab, and you know, the staff are so excited about this. And these are frontline staff that get the opportunity to become leaders and do something, and also get some recognition agency-wide. And it's a low-cost thing for us. Initially, it didn't feel like such a low cost, but it is a low cost thing, actually, in terms of what you get. The return that you get on that investment is really remarkable. So I just thought I'd share that because it's really effective for us.
That's great. I love that idea. Any others?
Yeah, Pat, I'm so glad you brought up this topic because I think it really is very real. And I think the more you want to recruit and retain staff who are truly reflecting the community you're serving, the more you're going to run into young people, and I say young people, people in their 20s, who, you know, can't rely on maybe living with mom and dad or having that safety net. So that salary is really paying their rent and their food bills and et cetera. So it's so important to develop these folks and hold on to them. And, you know, we do all of that. At Row New York, we try to do a lot of things around, you know, we do staff lunches twice a month where we actually provide food. And, you know, for our staff meetings, and then we'll do summer Fridays. And I totally agree with Thomas around, you know, closing between Christmas and New Year's that week, and doing, making sure there's plenty of paid time off, and, you know, because that doesn't, well, I would argue that actually does cost you some money, that paid time off, but it's well worth it, I think, and so thinking on the benefit side. But I would add, I'm starting to feel more and more that we have to sort of look at it as a whole sector, and look to our funders and talk to our funders about how we as a sector can start to bring up those entry-level position salaries. And I know Nonprofit Coordinating Committee just did their salary review survey, and I'm looking forward to seeing those results. And we're doing sort of our own with other, you know, peer organizations to sort of see where everybody is. And because I feel nervous about next year going to funders and saying, listen, we really want to do a major bump in salaries, which is something we do want to do, especially for our young staff. But I think that, you know, the more of us who can do that, the better. So it's not just one or two organizations saying, well, we just think we should bring up these numbers. I really feel like the whole sector needs to make an effort to come up.
I'm sorry. I want to piggyback on that for 1 second, because I think that's actually a really critical point. We focus a lot on sort of what are the innovative things that we do to take care of these staff and in these times that are so challenging. And I do think that there is actually a critical need for us not to get so overly focused on that we forget that the margin between the staff on the front lines and the people they serve is increasingly narrow, and that there is something that needs to happen on a much larger scale in order to address that. And I do think that the answer to that is in some sort of coming together. And just a plug for the 12% campaign that is being run by the Human Services Coalition.
Diane stole what I was going to add. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Human Services Council, and they are really incredibly effective in pushing on this very issue of the abysmally low compensation in the sector. And so if you're not familiar with the council, I would encourage you to go on their website and check it out. They're also joined by the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies and Fiscal Policy Institute in a campaign, very focused campaign that is trying to put pressure on city government in particular to look at the wages that are kept depressed artificially, oftentimes because of being dependent on city contracts for various positions. So,
and Allison just walked in from Human Service Council.
Allison Sesso just walked in. She's late. She missed our very articulate and eloquent plug for Human Services Council, but that's okay. She knows that we love her. So we're going to move on I have two more questions, and so I just want to remind everyone that questions on the index cards are going to be coming up very soon. But let me ask a little bit about advocacy. Speaking of Human Services Council, advocacy is not always the sort of top-tier part of the mission of many human service organizations. And pivoting, as we've been talking about this morning, takes up a lot of bandwidth. It takes up a lot of resources. So you may think, well, how in the world could I fit, advocacy into all of the other things that I'm sort of struggling with and challenged by? But it's also true that the same circumstances that create the need to pivot also very typically, very often, call out for advocacy on a policy or on issues that affect the sector overall. And so it's very challenging, I'm sure, for a nonprofit leader to kind of reconcile those two things. And so I think I'm going to direct this at Thomas because in particular, I know Dr. Birdsell says that we shouldn't frame all of what we're challenged with at this particular moment with what's going on in Washington, but you also can't ignore the fact that the very legitimacy of some organizations and what they do is actually being challenged by some of the political leaders in Washington now. And so I wonder if you could speak to how advocacy is or is not maybe still a part of what your organization is trying to accomplish, even in light of all of the various organizational resources that have to be directed at pivoting and responding to the uncertain times.
Sure. I'll take a deep breath.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot like that.
It's quite all right. So, working at an organization where it feels particularly of recent times where just existing means being an advocate, just being who you are as a person, let alone a community you serve. It starts with us again. You go back to the people and you go back to the mission, right? So if you think about your organization, any business, frankly, that you run, think of it as a target, apropos in this case, but think of it as a bullseye and what's core to who you are, to your existence, to executing your mission, and then looking peripherally or extending beyond that. And one of the things that we realized, and that frankly I thought we didn't fulfill, we didn't manifest our mission of creating replicable models. And so for us, creating replicable models now more than ever is incredibly important because we recognize that there are lots of caring adults out there and there are lots of communities that want to support, in this case, LGBTQ youth, particularly of color, but don't know how. And we also recognize that there are a lot of LGBTQ people that need a voice, have a voice, need a space to share their voice. Big difference. And so what we looked at, because even now the opportunities are tremendous, and you have to be a little Pollyanna to be in this business, right? Because never before to be a part of a civil rights movement is a privilege. And so how do you take that privilege? How do you take this opportunity that in my lifetime has never been more crystallized? And how do you engage stakeholders? And so, 4 years ago when we started the Advocacy and Capacity Building Center, I never imagined today the way we'd be using this work. But it has been so pivotal, with the pun, to be able to shift, to engage caring communities and to draw them in to the mission that we do, that we try to fulfill, and bring them into our work. And so for us, it has been really looking at what is the alignment out there, so who else feels similarly, what is our community, and what are our straight allies in this case, saying, needing, and listening to that voice, those voices, and then speaking to their listening, right? So if we have a message and you don't understand a word I'm saying, that's not going to be effective. And so really being able to build those bridges and communicate in a transparent way that people could understand. Here's a big one for us in our sector, allowing people to feel safe enough to be ignorant. That's very powerful. So I'd rather you ask the questions so you get the right answers, because your young people will do that every single day. And so I always like to tell people, from government leaders to 12-year-olds, you don't need to have the answers. You just want to be willing to take the journey to explore them together. Adults, we never need to have the answers. We just have to be willing participants to try and find them together. And so really looking at, as an organization, what were the opportunities presented? Where are those opportunities? So whether it's a training center or HMI New Jersey, where we know there are other communities that really want to do good work but don't know how. And with our limited resources, how do we not have to reinvent the wheel? And so really being able, think of the target, and that allowed us as a bullseye to also take the resources, time, people power, money, et cetera, on the outside and move them in so that they were core. And for us, that meant creating the advocacy center, looking for other communities, starting a new 501c3 in New Jersey, and making sure that the staff and board alignment was all there and that they had spaces to ask those questions as well. So we chart this course together.
Wonderful. All right. Wow.
That's a lot. I threw a lot out there, so each thing can be unpacked.
Any other thoughts on how to integrate advocacy into the work of an organization that's responding to these kinds of uncertain times?
I would just add that I think it's amazing that all you're doing in advocacy as part of your own organization and doing direct service. We have found it really challenging to have the kind of the bandwidth and to get our arms around the policies in enough detail to do it on our own. So we, and I think it's a lot of nonprofits do this, participate in intermediaries that do the advocacy. So as a workforce development organization, we're very active, and I sit on the board of New York City Employment Training Coalition. So similar to HSC and FPWA, like there's organizations that have the bandwidth, and their mission is to get really deep in the policies. And if your staff can get educated and plug in those ways, I've found it to be really effective.
That's a great idea, and I would say we are lucky to be in this city because there's such a rich network of those kinds of effective advocacy organizations and membership organizations. So I had another question, but right now I have like 22 brilliant questions on index cards, and we've got about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, so I'm going to leap right into, some of these are global and some of them are very specific, and so I'm going to start with a specific one, and the questioner asks, how many of you have your own internal capacity to measure program outputs or outcomes, and how many of you have had to seek financial support to hire external service providers to do this?
Well, I can start. At Roe New York, and just to put it out there, I think we're the youngest and have the smallest budget. We're at around a $3.5 million a year budget now. So we started doing evaluations, program evaluations, years and years ago, but it really wasn't until we engaged with Arbor Brothers, and if folks in the nonprofit world haven't worked with them, they were sort of like life-changing and organization-changing in my book. And they really helped us, work on coming up with what our metrics would be at Roe New York across, specifically across academics, fitness, and then social-emotional learning. And really that we spent most of the time with them on the social-emotional learning piece, because compared to academic progress and measurement of that progress for our kids, and then fitness, pretty easy, relatively speaking. The social-emotional growth was really, I thought, the most interesting and the most difficult, right? Because we all have our own ideas of what social-emotional learning and growth should look like, and they're not necessarily wrong that we have different ideas around that. It's just they are different. So as an organization, really homing in on what are we looking for in terms of that growth. And for Roe New York, it's self-confidence, it's tenacity, otherwise known as grit, but we thought that word was just a little trendy a few years ago. Wasn't sure if it would stick. And then sense of community. And so we have rubrics that we've put together. So for social-emotional learning, we have spent an enormous amount of time on data collection and analysis, and I'm sure my peers up here would say the same thing. It's just such an important piece. And yes, it didn't cost money because it was a grant, but if we hadn't had the grant from Arbor Brothers, I'm sure we would have been spending money on it. And it's, you know, I was on a panel recently that was all about evaluations, and I can't say enough how I think as organizations we tend to underestimate how much time is involved and bandwidth when you're really focused on raising the money and running the programs, and then, oh wait, there's that other really important piece that is complicated, and as Lisa at Row New York, it's complicated and messy, or can be messy, and really takes resources. So.
If I may?
Sure.
So this was a great example of where we looked. So data is about telling a story, right? And so we looked at what was the value of telling a story, particularly in a community where there's a lot of mythology out there, or there's a lot of void, and so people don't know the stories. And then we looked at, so who are the stakeholders that want to hear your story? And who are the intermediate? That's a great example. Who are the bridges that will help you? And so we looked at Moody's. Big shout out to Moody's, the credit rating agency, because they're all about telling stories with data. And so we went there, and Moody's was fundamental in helping us really. We adopted Salesforce internally. It's a beast, but boy, is it worth it. And then used that to really tell a story. So we aligned with for-profit or their foundations around how do we tell that story? How do we get our data? And frankly, forgive me for evaluators, they're fabulous, and we do have an external one that works with us. How do we not overthink it? So we tend to so often want to overdo, right? We're conditioned to do that with $1. Let's see how far we can go. When the simplest stuff, the direct line, really is illuminating and helps. And so with Moody's, taking for HMI, I can't prove this, but I surmise that we're probably sitting on the largest database on the planet. Think about that, for LGBTQ youth, because we've been doing this work since 1979. And could you imagine the stories that exist in my sub-basement in cardboard boxes? Not joking. And so being able to really work to start to tell those stories, and then pulling in a group like Frameworks, all pro bono with the work, thanks to Allison, to really help us tell the story, because we recognized on a larger level in this country and beyond that, particularly in our sector, in LGBT work, the stories are either not there, or there are very few of them, and the same ones are repeated over and over, and they're really not expansive. So yes, we have it internally, we work with external evaluators, and it's about telling our story.
Great. Anyone else want to speak on this issue, this question of finding resources, either internally or externally, to tell the story using data?
I would just add that I think, I mean, internally or externally, it's money that you have to raise, and because data is so important, I think most of us up here use Salesforce, and Salesforce is amazing, but it takes money to set it up with what the fields you want to capture, and then it's pretty sophisticated, so it takes money to train staff on how to enter the data, it takes money to train the staff on how to pull out the data. We're very fortunate that, well, we write into almost every grant proposal that we put together, a piece for data. So we have a part-time Salesforce administrator. So when the reports are a little bit more complicated than the basic reports that our staff can pull on a regular basis, or we've set up for them to pull, we do have someone that is on staff that helps us with that. And I think it is, it's beyond useful, because data is stories, and stories are so compelling. To have a resource that, like, I can leave this meeting, and if someone asks me a question about our data, I can email her and she can figure out and set up the new fields to do it. It's incredibly helpful. Yeah.
All right, here is, it's not a question, it's a statement, and so I'm not sure, there may be others who have this experience on the panel. We have significant paid vacation and paid time off, but many staff feel they can't use it and get their work done.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I can relate to that.
You're right.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a whole lot to say to that, but I thought it just struck me, so I thought I would read it.
Can I just, because, so that's talking about culture, to me. That's how I hear that. So, and we all know our role in setting culture or being a part of what culture you want it to be. And so, start with that. Like, what is the, like, what culture is often what's below the surface. So if someone takes off, how is that received, really received at an organization? If someone is on vacation, why are they answering their emails? So I will actually write, I just had my COO, she was in Italy, so I know a little Italian, and I used Google Translate to say, why are you on your email? Because you need the vacation. It's back to this other question around self-care, and that requires discipline. And I am a hypocrite right now, but let's own that. Exactly. Let's own that, right? But then recognize that I'm being a hypocrite, right? So because those messages go to the frontline staff.
Acknowledgement is the first step to fixing the problem.
Amen.
Jennifer said she's on vacation right now.
All right, so we're not going to delve any more into that question. Okay. All nonprofits are trying to diversify funds, and earned income is one way to do that. Can the panelists talk about what they have learned building revenue-generating activities? I suppose this is in the context of looking at earned income, and revenue-generating activities is one way to pivot.
About 23% of our income now is through revenue-generating streams. So. What was the question about it, though? Sorry.
What have you learned?
Vacation. Oh, yes. What have I learned? Vacation. Yeah, I think it's also another piece that is so valuable, right? Because we found that it's money we can count on more. You can be more deliberate in your revenue streams and your forecasting. I found with the earned income, and for us, what does that look like? It's corporate team building. So get Morgan Stanley on the water. Or Goldman Sachs, it's Adult Learn to Row, it's renting space to private schools to come and run their own rowing programs. So it's great. What I've learned is, a couple of things you need to be careful of is making sure you're budgeting to put enough resources into, to bring in money. It costs money. And then also sort of what has been a little sneaky for us is to make sure that, it's sneaky, I mean, as a problem that's come up is to really make sure that the communication is happening to the staff, that we are not losing focus on our mission. We are not, suddenly interested in only generating revenue. I think from the program staff, the feeling can be sort of, oh, wow, is that all that the care about now? When certainly it isn't. It's just about bringing in some money. But you have to be really careful, I think, about the optics of it and making sure that you're never, ever, ever threatening the mission-based programs, and that can look like staff, boathouse time, equipment, all sorts of things. So it's really just always being cognizant of not just doing the thing and bringing in the money, but what does that look like, and are you communicating it effectively across the organization?
We went to Taproot, and so Taproot, again, big believer in pro bono services and kind exchanges, actually helped us create a fee-for-service model. And so you're able now to plug in amount of staff time, the content, the value that we think it gets, and our training center actually utilizes a fee-for-service model. It's ironic. I've had for-profit corporations, when we quoted them a price, say, yeah, no, that's way too low. Come back to me. So talk about being conditioned in the human service sector. Yeah. But I think what you just said is fantastic about making sure there's communication and transparency for your own staff. Because again, who's drawn to the work and charging a fee is so not traditional in many organizations or mindsets. That's really important.
I'll just add one thing to that. Actually, we went through a process a couple of years ago with the program that I talked about having been adopted by the New York City Department of Youth and Community Development with Morgan Stanley, actually, and they were like, you need to monetize this, you need to take this to the field immediately. And we actually decided at that point in time not to do that. for a couple of different reasons. One is the investment that Amanda talked about that it takes on the front end in terms of hiring the staff and actually launching that operation was not something that we felt like we had the bandwidth at that point in time to take on, particularly given that we had just gone through this theory of change and were so laser-like focused on where we wanted to prioritize our programming. 4 years later, we're in a different place. One of our career development programs, we just went through a process with Barclays, and they came back and said, you can do this. And so now we're actually having the conversation as to what it would take for us to bring on the capacity to launch this generating revenue model that has actually been in demand. We've had people from Westchester ask us to bring it. We've had major hospitals ask us to replicate. And now we're positioned differently. So I think that there are a lot of different factors to take into consideration when you think about this, the investment being one, the demand being another, the mission and how that contributes to or sort of not deflects from, but how you do that as an adjacent practice to your core mission programs is key.
Oh, wonderful. All right. I have this is a good one, may take us to the closing. Please address potential problems and pivots related to donors who want to move their funding to address specific issues arising from our current political climate. How do we keep donors?
And the magic answer is, sorry.
Never mind.
No, I have
I mean, I think that's the question that's keeping us all up at night when, our holiday appeal, which usually brings in a significant amount of revenue, we saw a bit of a decline this year, and we know why. I mean, and the ACLU and Planned Parenthood and lots of other great, amazing organizations. People kind of redirected, and I think it's incumbent upon us, and we talk about this as a senior staff team a lot. The folks that we serve are vulnerable in so many ways to so many of the policies that are coming down or potentially coming down, and so to make that connection for the people who have been loyal and consistent and generous over the years, so that they maybe were always thinking they were giving to workforce development or to support people with career advancement, and kind of making sure to tell the story about the folks that they're serving are the folks that also are most vulnerable to some of the things that are going on in these uncertain times.
So for us, we actually were going. Now it's a very different landscape, but we were living that every day in my community. My mantra became, it's more than marriage, right? So for us, it was affluent, mostly cisgender white men, gay men, who got married, and many who walked away from the table. And so it was, how do you educate? That was really big. Like, what's the story you want to tell, and how do you speak so that they can hear it? And so a lot of it for us was shifting the message. How do you frame it in the way that they can hear it, that they understand the struggle isn't over, and that this affects them, right? For better or worse, and in this case, obviously, for worse. And so it was really talking to their, and this is where frameworks came in really well, which is talking to their, speaking to their listening in a way that they understood that everyone deserved the same right, the same privilege, and then envisioning what that looked like. And so now it's a very different landscape, and they're back to the table. But for us, what was effective was, who was the donor on the other end? What was their world like? And where was the intersection? What was the bridge that connected them in the first place to our mission? Because unless we changed our mission, we're still doing that work. And so it was about rekindling and reminding them in an educative way.
Okay. All right. I think we have time for one more question. And so this is a pretty straightforward one. It's asking what organizations advocate on behalf of NGOs in Washington. And I guess I would expand on that to say a couple of people have mentioned the importance of various intermediaries here in New York City. And so if any of you want to, this is the time, I guess, to shout out any organizations that you think are really important for the people in this room to know about if they don't already.
Well, all right, so I guess I mentioned the 12% campaign earlier. The Human Services Council, and Allison, who's standing in the back, has launched a 12% campaign to advocate on behalf of the sector with the city specifically. There's also a campaign that they're coordinating in partnership with the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies at the state level. But in terms of those of us here in the city who have a large percentage of city contracts, it's important to know that this effort is underway right now. It's about really shoring us up so that we can become or continue to be the sanctuary city that the mayor talks about us being. It's about shoring us up so that we are better able to address the equity agenda, and so that the brown and black folks who do this work on the front lines are actually part of that equity agenda front and center. And it's about really sort of trying to gain a little ground on the years and years of flatlined contracts that we've had as providers in the city that have not enabled us to provide increases to our staff that are meaningful, keep up with health insurance premiums, take care of the leaky roof, or deal with the increases in our rent. So I encourage you all to get more information. Allison's here. I'm happy to talk about it as well. And that's a key initiative for us right now.
Something to add, if I may, to that as well was you may find yourself, because of the work you do, that there are no national. So there is no LGBTQ national youth organization out there that really has us front and center in terms of our mission. And the one that did exist, NYAC, National Youth Advocacy Coalition, disbanded, it folded. So you may find yourself being that person or those people. And so in our case, it was back to looking at the intersections, whether it's poverty or race or education or health care. Where are those conversations already happening? Because we all have limited bandwidth, and then inserting yourself, finding an ally and trying to figure out how do you get your conversation, your mission into that conversation, and not recreating the wheel.
I think I mentioned them before, the New York City Employment Training Coalition. They do advocacy mostly at a city level, but support organizations that are doing it on a state and federal level in the workforce space. And once a month, I think it's Mondays at 4, but I can give you more information if you want. They do a legislative policy advocacy committee that brings together staff at all different levels from all different nonprofits to kind of voice what's important to them, what are the issues they're worrying about, and then come together to make decisions and decide platforms. And so it's a great advocacy organization, and they're connected with lots of other ones on state and federal level.
And I would just conclude by saying that there is an incredible array of intermediaries and organizations in New York City, and as the program officer at the trust that's responsible for, among other things, nonprofit capacity building, I could, if people have specific questions, I'm happy to try to respond and give you some suggested intermediaries that you might want to connect to. And so I think with that, I see Claire approaching. That means our time is up. This panel has been amazing, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And just as a footnote on that, in your kits, you'll find that there is a directory of these organizations, which can help you connect as well. So it's exciting being in the thick of this conversation, yes? It started with Dean Birdsell talking about an actually heartening point that there is an uptick in trust in NGOs. Timothy Stiles from KPMG mentioning that we have this opportunity around the world for people to see how we do things here. And now, a panel that has said to us that in order to be true to our missions, Sometimes we have to pivot, and sometimes that means hard decisions on our infrastructure, our programs. It means diversifying our resources, the financial as well as human resources and other resources. So we're in the thick of it. Now we need a break. 10 minutes. Back in your seats in 10 minutes.